Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Daanish TV's English language news channel, the global voice of the Center for Islam and Decoloniality. And today, I always do stress these things that we try to bring to you some of the most astute, erudite, um, eh, transformative individuals that we have in the world today in terms of the critical thinking that they're doing in trying to bring Muslims, non-Muslims, humanity towards towards that direction of a more humane and a just society that is also ecologically sustainable and so on. So today, of course, it is an incredible delight and treat for all of us to have a very dear friend, a mentor, someone I've learned so much from, a friend from some my years in South Africa, Imam Dr. Shahid Mathee, who's a professor of religious studies at the University of Johannesburg, and you just on a personal note. You hear the man and his lectures and his khutbahs, and I don't remember a single khutbah of his where I don't leave just with tears in my eyes because it is so emotional and it inspires you to do the work that I think that our prophetic tradition requires us to do. So welcome and Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Shahid Mathee.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah, Junaid Bhai, to yourself and your team and everybody who's working with you. Let me firstly say thank you very much for this invite. I mean, it reminds me of that at least when we're speaking, that's important. Of course, speaking is not sufficient, but perhaps we haven't begun speaking sufficiently. I think Shariati mentioned that a few years ago, and he said that we haven't even began speaking. Of course, we should go beyond speaking. We should act as the Quran calls upon us. So thank you very much to you and everyone for making possible this conversation. And emphasize the conversation. We listen to one another, from one another, then we talk and we learn from one another, inshallah.
Absolutely, inshallah. Thank you. Brother Shaibati, I wanted to focus on two themes, and I will let our audience, which is both, I mean, also for your information, it is a this is a global viewership. We have obviously Pakistani viewership and a global viewership, but I wanted to focus on two things specifically, and I especially think that within the Pakistani context and the larger Islamic context, that this is a central question that we do interrogate, try to kind of figure out what the relationship of Muslims, of Muslim communities that have a tradition, that deeply feel inside them that they do have a tradition that is on that in which they know that that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Prophet, peace be upon him, there's a tradition of being on the side of social justice and so on. Now, as these communities, whether in Pakistan or any other Muslim majority society where Muslims are in a minority context or so on, what is the relationship between their situation there, and of course Muslims themselves are of course not a monolith. They are distinguished between class and gender and so on, but the relationship between the Ummah, the Muslims, and the question of power, and the question of power, whether that power be in the form of a political unit like the state or any other sort of entity that we have right now. Of course, we live in the era of nation states, so this is what we're talking about. But what in your view, historically, in the tradition that we have, that we can use, that are resources there that may be useful for a certain time, may not be useful for this time, because I also want to, and I apologize for this, I want to let our audience know that Imam Dr. Shahid Mathee is a fully trained alim. He was at Al Azhar and so on. And so my respect for Imam Shahid Mathee is second to none. So if anyone I want to ask these questions to, it is our brother here today. So Imam, if you could just address this question of relationship of Muslims to power in that sense. In the I know it's a very broad question, but your reflections on it.
So I think if we go to the Quran and of course the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, but let's start with Al-Quran Al-Kareem, Surah Al-Hadid. Why were the Anbiya sent? Why were Rusul sent? Okay. وَأَنزَلْنَا مَعَ الْكِتَابَ لِيَقُومَ النَّاسُ بِالْقِسْطِ, so that people can establish justice. Now it starts with justice. Now, of course, there's the notion of imama, what is referred to in kalam as imamas, whether we speak about siyasatul dawla, the running of the country, or hirasatul deen, or protecting the country. So, but the Quran refers to imama. Let me say, when the Quran refers to imama, it doesn't begin necessarily, it doesn't exclude it, but it's not essentially, or it's not that where you have a president or a king or who was called Amirul Mu'mineen or the Khalifa. That imam, the Quran gives us its muwasafat of that, the condition. It describes that imam. For example, if we look at surah number 21, who are the imam? When he speaks about Ibrahim, there are certain muwasafat. For example, one is justice, etc. So we understand that there must be a leadership in a country. The question is how we define it. And I think here, Brother Jayat, to your respected audience, this is where we need to discuss. I think what we can do is to go back to the Kalam text and the fiqh text, example al-Imam, for example, books of such as Al-Mawardi's Ahkam al-Sultaniyya. But at the same time, we must have a critique of it. So a typical definition of imama, and we speak about, let's translate it as power, right? The government of the country, whether it is the khilafah, and some Muslims are asking for the khilafah to come back. We've seen ISIS have made some claims, right or wrong, whatever we think, that's a critical discussion that must be had. Okay, some Muslims are speaking about the nation state. What all these scholars over the centuries said, that they wanted order. They wanted to ensure order in society, because they were afraid that if you don't have order, you're going to have chaos. You're going to have what is called fitna and fawda. Okay, that often is translated as anarchy. I'm not speaking anarchy, the school of anarchism. Anarchism, that's of course a different philosophical approach or a philosophical trend. But the Muslim jurists were often afraid that if you don't have a ruler, if you don't have a ruling apparatus, call it the nation state, call it the khilafah, call it the khalifa, the Amirul Mu'mineen, then you're going to have you're going to have chaos. Okay, and therefore they had this very famous dictum, especially in Sunni thought, that said, Hakim Rashum Khairun min fitnatin tadum. They said that, an oppressive ruler is better than fitna, than a state of civil war, of chaos that is continuous. Now, we should not understand from that these scholars necessarily wanted an oppressive ruler. No, but they said, this notion of the less of two evils. Okay, that's it. But at the same, let's go to the Quran. The Quran, when it speaks about him, and it uses the term imam. For example, this Quran speaks about a'immatus su. It speaks about the evil, the bad imams in Surah Tawbah, and it speaks about the good imams, Ibrahim. Kanu yahdu bi amrina, yahduna bi amrina, that they guide according to our decree. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. Ibrahim, the Quran outlines this individual, inni ja'iluka linnasi imama, that I will make you an imam. Right? This obviously would mean authority. Authority, sister, an ethical, moral authority, before it becomes, authority where you just pay your allegiance. The imam is this good person, this pure person, this competent person that can lead us. And this is the problem that we've been sitting with in the Muslim world over all these centuries. And here the critique I just mentioned earlier, when some of these scholars had this dictum that you rather have an oppressive ruler. The problem is that the Muslim world in that kalam, which translates theology, we appear, and I want to be careful, I don't want to just throw accusations around. It appears that we have not moved beyond that. The coming of Sisi to power, the whole Muslim world again, the coup d'etat. Uh, uh, However we read it, and we must read the situation critically, in Syria, in Lebanon, even in Iran and these places, we need to discuss this question now. What is the relationship? Let me put it this way. Who then becomes the authority? What are the rules for that person becoming into authority? I think these are questions that we really need to discuss. We need to go to concepts of Wilayat al-Faqih. We need to discuss Maududi and Sayyid Quds al-Hakimiyya. What does it mean at this stage? Of course, much and lots of books have been written. But can we sit back beyond our own ideological leanings, and critically look at that question? The problem today in the Muslim world is that you have the political authority, but does the Muslim individual exist? I think, unfortunately, the Muslim individual does not exist. Not in countries such as Egypt and Saddam's Iraq, or even in Syria. And I'm saying this critically. Yes. And not to take a particular position against anyone, but even in democratic countries where Muslims vote, and it's important that they vote, such as Pakistan, and I think it's an important, but does the Muslim individual exist? Once we understand that the individual is the basis of everything, the one person, these individuals come together and then form an ummah. Remember, Ibrahim is called an ummah. Ummah is not nation. It's the most wrong and unscientific translation to translate ummah as nation. Ummah has never meant nation in the language of the Quran. Ummah means individuals who believe in Allah, who have taqwa, who are aware of their duty. They come together. So these different individual ummahs then come together and form an ummah. Not a nation, not a political entity, but originally people of belief and taqwa. Let me leave it at that, but just to say for now, and I think once we get that relationship, we begin working on it, we begin questioning it, and then we can move forward. But until then, we're going to have rulers who come to power, whether by the ballot or whether by the gun, and the Muslim individual does not exist. And this is, I think, our big dilemma. But should we have a leadership? Of course. Should we have? So I said earlier to Junaid, the point is not to say we should be against the state, that we should do away with the state. No, we need order. We know, we've read that in the philosophical works. But before that, the Quran gives us an idea that there is a notion of imama, of leadership. But who and how, that is what we need to discuss.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you for that, Brother Shahid. The one thing, Shahid Bhai, I did want to say is that you did emphasize a certain a tendency within that discursive tradition in which the ruler, even if not the perfect ruler, the privileging of order over fitna, this type of thing. So in the current predicament right now, I mean, and so that people will that are interested in seeing what's going on in the Islamic world, where you have a perception of many Muslim regimes that have effectively become subservient to, particularly in the West Asian region, to Zionism, to imperialism, and so on. What is the Muslim to do? You're spot on. The Muslim individual, What are these Muslim individuals to do in these circumstances? Because on the one hand, then the response comes from a lot of these other groups, from the Al Qaeda's and the ISIS. Well, look, these are illegitimate regimes, and then therefore we have a right to actually carry on these struggles ourselves. So, what would your response be,
Okay. Now, I think there's an extremely important diagnosis that you're giving. There will be, Junaid Bhai. The problem is that Muslims, especially in the last 100 years, and let me even say the last 20 years, or even say 40 years, we always only given two choices, as if there's no third choice. Either, exactly, you have this dictatorship, You know, so for example, in as much as I disagree, and I think I can say this for you too, we disagree with ISIS. They do very wrong things, and we disagree with Al Qaeda. At the same time, they are products of our society. They are us, right? And then we are told, look, if you don't stick with Sisi, if you don't stick, say, with the governments even in Syria and those places, then you're going to have Al Qaeda. Then you're going to have ISIS. You're going to have this extremism. Why are we only given two choices, as if there is no third choice? And earlier we spoke about these, even the secularists sometimes do this. So you know what? Rather than have the Islamists coming to power, let us have, you know, the dictators, because they're going to protect from Islamists. And that is why then they think they use these dictators in the meantime. And to an extent, they do use the dictators. But in the meantime, at the end, you know, final analysis says dictators use them. We should, the best I can answer that question, Junaid, is that we should strive and struggle. That's why I'm saying we'll be very, very careful and very cautious how we have power, how we have relationships with power. There's a whole genre of ahadith. That's why, you know, all these small that we read in the Muslim literature, when scholars, for example, said, stay away from the door of the Sultan. You know, some of these scholars even said, don't even, for example, don't even be a tailor for the Sultan. Now, of course, we shouldn't understand all those things literally all the time, because there has to be a ruler. Even if we say that there does not have to be a ruler, the reality is there's a ruler in place. And there has got to be interaction. But the point is that how careful we should be, you know, with these rulers. And then there should be struggle. We should rise up. We should stand up. We should speak out against the oppressors. We should not accept them. And this is my critique of the traditional Muslim discourse. It says, when they said, because they were so afraid of quote unquote, not the philosophical, you know, I'm talking about the literal meaning of anarchy, the lexical meaning of anarchy, right. Not as a school, as a philosophical school, of chaos. They were so afraid that they said,
we will ask Umar to deal with anarchism and
yes. No, I know. I'm saying I want to be fair as we try to be methodological. I don't do so that people understand anarchy, the school, you know, people like Stirner, and then you know the other scholars. I mean the lexical meaning is that they were so afraid of that the only thing they left us with, it was unintentional. I don't think we should see them as bad or people. So I'm saying, let's be careful of calling the scholars, you know, that they were in support of oppression. So much they want to avoid A, that they didn't realize they led us to B. Instead of saying, but they are C and D as alternatives. And therefore, we got to strive to find what is C and what is D. Okay, so we got to strive, and therefore we must be very, very careful and very circumspect of our relationship with power. And often that is where we fail. The Islamists have failed often in that. You know, in the Jamaat Islami, when Zia al-Haq built some mosques and established certain things, and in a sense, he neutralized. I'm going to be careful. I'm not going to say that the Jamaat Islami sold out. I think we must stay away from that type of moralizing statements. At the same time, we've got to be careful. This is what happened to Hassan al-Turabi in the Sudan with Ja'far al-Numairi. This is what happened to the Ikhwan often in the early years in the Gulf years. I'm talking about the 80s and so, you know, Anwar as-Sadat, in order to neutralize the Nasiris, he allowed, you know, the Ikhwan certain space, but only to hit them hard again. So what I'm saying to your question is that let's educate, let's have this program, let's speak about what the Quran says, let's learn from our great legacy, but it's also a problematic legacy. Let's look at this legacy, what is good, it's bad, and it's ugly, because it has a lot of beauty, but it also has a lot of ugly and bad. And here again, I don't want to so much make a moralistic statement. Look, human beings are Muslims are human beings. Worse than that, we cannot say about ourselves. We are humans, like all others, like Hindus, like Christians, like Jews are. What sets apart is how we follow this message of Al-Quran Al-Kareem. Your outlook, the ambitions, the thoughts that come to us, our anxieties, our fears, no different from Christians and Hindus and even atheists and all those other people. But we have a Quranic message. And this Quranic message is that there is no way that power becomes the only way which you can achieve things. I think, and therefore for us, Let us educate. Let's begin our madaris. Our syllabus must change at madaris level. Whether we speak about things like gender, about class, we got to relook. We got to relook at the great fiqh, of all the imams and all the great scholars, and say they were human beings without throwing them away, and say, let us read these things critically. We will at times have to take, you use the word earlier, and I think it's an important word. Sometimes we'll be shocked that if we have to say that, listen, what Al-Mawardi wrote, or what Abu Hanifa, Abu Yusuf al-Shafi'i said, no, this just cannot be right. What some of the hadith texts hold just cannot be right. It's problematic. That does not mean throwing away anything of our legacy.
Right.
We uphold our legacy. We stand in awe of this great legacy that the scholars and the generations before us left for us. But at the same time, we can read them critically. So it is education. But I think the most important thing is not simply coming to power. And I think that's the problem. ISIS want to come to power. Sometimes I think, everybody wants to come to power. And then we assume that once we're in power, we're going to change things. We've seen, even for sincere people, coming into power does not mean you're going to achieve everything, right? So it is for us then to continue this jihad, this continuous jihad, and to say that, will I be able to say to Allah on Qiyamah that I have done my duty? We may not have established the Islamic State or the socialist state, okay, but we strove. At the same time, we want social justice. We want the equal distribution of wealth. There cannot be poverty. We know that there is something seriously wrong in our society when some Muslims can go every year for Hajj, can do everything, and there are some other Muslims who are dying. Rats are living in their house. This is something seriously wrong. So you mentioned earlier about social justice. The Quranic message is that if we live as Allah wants us to live, then these things will be in place. So what it means, because we're having these inequalities in societies, we're having suffering of Muslim women, of children. Look at what is happening in all our countries, with civil war, without civil war. It means then we are not living the message of Allah. We are not true human beings, and we are not living the message of the Quran. But Junaid, perhaps you'd see that I don't have any answers, to be frank with you. I don't know how. What I do know is that when we speak from this, and I want to end off here again saying, but things are happening.
Yes.
And that's why we should always have this optimism that
Yes.
we're not totally
But I'm
lost.
not going to let you end. Just one final question, Shahid Bhai, and that is because I want to really relate it to a very dominant narrative and discourse that we hear, and I want to have you respond to it and see what your perspective, because and it's really, I mean, to be quite candid and frank about it, uh, it's really disturbing for many of us, where we're talking about religious scholars who, again, as we've been discussing throughout, which Islam is the flavor of the month, of the year, of the decade, and so on. So now it is a form of moderate Islam that was cultivated under Musharraf and so
Yes.
on. And we have had people who have been promoted very heavily, individuals, very, and when we speak about this, many of us, oftentimes it's just like one or two who are deeply promoted, and they have we have the discourse that has dominated Pakistan. Also, we have had an individual in India, I won't use names or anything, but a discourse which has basically emphasized the delegitimization of any form of Muslim resistance to foreign occupation, whether in Kashmir, Palestine, Iraq, etc., so on and so forth, because they say, well, no, this is not where Muslims are not allowed. Muslims need to develop themselves. They are probably in that. This is the old colonial logic as well. They're in that predicament because they were weak in the first place, and they need to develop themselves and spiritually, and then you start to go to the extreme of the Tablighi Jamaat, and then it's just personal purification, and don't worry about the rest. but this is a very dominant narrative, which
Absolutely.
you can imagine disturbs me very much, and probably disturbs you very much as well, because we are told to fight oppression. When there is oppression, we
Absolutely.
must struggle against it. And so, just
No,
as final, and I would like you to mention, I mean, the prophetic paradigm of all the prophets in this sense, please.
look, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think, and as you spoke about this moderate Islam, and therefore we see it in things like the governments must now prescribe, the Muslim syllabus. So we'll take out things, even leave alone from the curriculum, but even from, unfortunately, from our vocabulary, words such as jihad. Words such as harb must be taken out, and that's a very, very disturbing. It's a very dangerous. What is moderate Islam? If anybody can define me, and as you and I think you put it accurately, Junaid, you said, Islam is the flavor of the day, and we see this. So certain books have to be banned. For example, I disagree with a lot of Ibn Taymiyyah's works, a lot of his works, because I think too he was driven too much by power. But for anybody to suggest that Ibn Taymiyyah's books must be banned and to be burned, that is a travesty. That is just wrong. We can disagree because it takes away from Muslims. What it says to Muslims, you are unable to think. So these moderate and those secular, often secular, not alone, and we must be clear, not all secular, whatever secular against mean, but some of these secular elite and these intellectuals, they will now decide for us whether it pertains to gender. You know the example that Ashish Nandi gives, for example, in the case of India, where he speaks about sadi, right? The practice of sadi, and he takes it back to the story of Madri, right? And Pandu. He says, now some of these indicate, and therefore Muslims and other people, we're not very different from other people. We must get away from this, that Muslims are somehow unique, because we end up with this danger of abnormalizing Muslims. Of course, we've got they're very different contexts, very different struggle, very different realities. I'm not putting that aside. But now, some of example, what Ashish Nandi points out, that some of these Hindu intellectuals saying now you must ban the stories in the Mahabharata. Why? Because Nandi is not, he's against Sadi. But he's saying that, look, let us understand certain stories. So, for example, so some of the secular elite will have us take away so much, because they will now tell us what is Islam, what is good Islam, and we think about Mamdani, right? Good Muslim, bad Muslim. So now we have to please who? Please who? The West? Please this enemy that brought colonialism to our lands, that created Israel, and we must now please them. And firstly, that just takes away from you as a human being. So we can go to, as I said, there are lots of problematic issues in our text. Why? First and foremost, it's a human text. All our great predecessors were human beings. They were sons and daughters of their time, of their context. They had their own they had their own issues of the day. They had their own ambitions. Like we have, they had their own anxieties. They had their own vested interests. I'm not sitting here, some pure human being, speaking to you, Junaid Bhai. I've got my own ambitions. I've got my own anxieties. I've got my own fears. I've got my own desires. Of course, what the Muslim will then say, that with all these anxieties, all these fears, all these ambitions, I must remember Allah, because to Allah will return. Nevertheless, so when these people come and want to now sanitize our curriculum, want to teach us what is called moderate Islam, which is a terrible term, which firstly means nothing, but it seeks to divert Islam. And he's saying to Muslims, most of you Muslims are stupid. You don't know how to read your text, so we will tell you. And you know that Germany is doing that. That's why in France now, they are appointing imams. And those Muslims, I say it without fear or favor, those who respond, whether the German government, the French government, to now purify the syllabus, they are traitors. We must have no doubt about it that they are traitors. If you are afraid and you cannot speak, if they cannot speak out, they should just leave things for the Muslims to then say. Of course, on the other hand, it leaves us the duty, as I said, to critically read, our text, and then to look at things. How are we going to look at jihad? To find a critique. Why did we have ISIS? ISIS reminded us of certain things, or the Islamic State, as I call them, what they call themselves. I don't agree that the Islamic State, but that is what they call themselves. So, for example, we've got to reread the slave legacy in the Quran, that the early Muslims made a mistake. And I say, absolutely, whether we speak even about Sahaba, that when they said that you can enslave a person who is not Muslim at the time of conquest, I'm saying that they made a mistake. I'm saying the the best generation made a mistake. And the problem is that unless we go back to the legacy that first generation of Muslims made a mistake by saying it is permissible, because the Quran doesn't say, yes, we can, and again, I want to emphasize the importance of the Hadith legacy. We cannot do without the Hadith legacy. But the Hadith legacy, and here we come back to this great scholar Fazlur Rahman, with all our critique of him, that
Yes.
I will advise that we all read this book again, The Islamic Methodology in History.
Yeah.
I think it gives us a good understanding. At the same time, what I'm saying is that we should be able, because if people had to be enslaved, why didn't the Prophet enslave the people of Makkah, the Mushrikeen and Fathul Makkah? They were not Muslim at the time. So it was when the Muslims became an empire, and we forgot about, we saw power. See the learnings of power. Then we decided, okay, now we can take these people who are not Muslims, we can take them as slaves. And especially this happened in so-called Black Africa, Brother Junaid. It is horrendous. It is horrendous what some Muslims did to darker skinned people. It's something that we don't want to speak all about. Nevertheless, let me not go. You asked me a very specific question. You are right. We should be very, very careful of this moderate Islam. This moderate Islam wants to, because it wants to hearken to the hegemonic discourse, which is that of the West. I'm not here to please the West. I'm here to understand my own condition of human beings and to make our contribution. So therefore, we should be very, very, very careful. And sometimes we must call out moderate Islam for what it was, for what it is. It is an attempt to dilute Islam often. Let us discuss jihad. Let us discuss war. But then we can discuss when can there be war, when there must be resistance, when there should be. Of course, there should be a time where we can say, in the case of and if you know this, Junaid Bhai, that when it comes to facing up to the Zionist enemy, then it is not enough to condemn Israel for its atrocities. That's part of it. I said this a few years ago to the guys in BDS in South Africa. You cannot say I condemn Israel, but I also condemn the rockets of the resistance. No. It should be I condemn Israel and I praise the rockets of the resistance, because this resistance is fighting against, and we know it is to bring about the justice, as you earlier pointed out. Yes, and we'll be critical of the Islamic movements because they are human beings. Hamas makes mistakes, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah make mistakes. In Lebanon, we should not treat them as people who are above. They make their mistakes. But it is these young women and young men of Islamic resistance. I remember a phrase that you used at the University of Cape Town, Junaid Bhai, where you said, when Hezbollah wiped Israel's the face of the earth with Israel. That is a very important statement.
The Israeli, the Lebanese, the Hezbollah fighters wiped the floor with Israeli soldiers fighting hand-to-hand combat.
And it's important, it's extremely important that, Brother Junaid, because if it was not for these young women and young men in the resistance in Palestine who are throwing the stones, Israel would have been walking, and therefore I am not going to make an apology. I'm not going to apologize for the resistance. I stand with the resistance. I have a critique for them in other ways, but I stand fully with them that nobody must say that we have to take out the word jihad from our vocabulary. We have to take the word harb, muqawama. All these words are important in the same way, as Muslims in other parts of the world fought against imperialism. Of course, we are not advocating fighting, and that's a problem. That's our critique of ISIS, and they often appear not to know just why they're fighting. But at the same time, we cannot have this moderate Islam because it does represent. And finally, let me say, it's again this elitist discourse. This is, and this it denies the existence of the you and I as the ordinary, everyday Muslim female and male, Muslim women and men, that we know what is good for you and we will guide you. You just listen to us and you shut up. That's what they're actually saying.
And clearly, in the contemporary context, an elite enterprise tied directly to an imperial project to pacify,
Absolutely.
to pacify
Absolutely.
and subjugate, and to recolonize in some ways Muslim lands.
Absolutely.
There's no doubt about it. Shahid Bhai, brother, Dr. Shahid Mathee, thank you so much for being with us today. This is a pure delight. I think for everyone, there will be no doubt about it in the eyes of our viewers, people who will give us feedback. Thank you so much. And I really, Shahid Bhai, I will try to cajole you and arm twist you to please come back on our show again, inshallah.
But I also need to listen to you. You must please tell me when of our other sisters and brothers. And pardon me for, and I'm sure happens, especially to listen to what our sisters have to say. But our brothers, I want to be part of the audience to also listen. So please do tell me when our fellow human beings and Muslims are speaking, so that I can join in
Oh,
and
yes.
just listen also.
We will
And
send you to the YouTube channel in which we have both brothers and sisters, activists, and from all over the world that we've already interviewed. So, absolutely.
and also we can listen to the more lighter things, to the art that our young Muslim girls and boys and are making, music and all those things, because that is all our talent,
This
and
is all
Muslims have
part of our
contributed to
tradition.
all this.
This is all part of our
Jazakallah
tradition.
for having me, Junaid. I'm the one who's indebted to you. And any mistakes or something said wrongly, I my apologies for that. But we will keep on talking and progressing.
Inshallah.
Jazakallah.
Inshallah. Jazakallah. Thank you so much, Brother Shahid. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.